The subject of this presentation is Common Core state standards. To say that Common Core has become controversial is a bit of an understatement. The controversy is not along political party lines or pro-union, anti-union, or pro-this or anti-that. This presentation will offer you the background behind Common Core, its myths and facts. Let's begin by reviewing the official stated goals of Common Core. Currently, standards in English and mathematics have been adopted by approximately 45 states. Standards for science and social studies will come later in the process. The English and math standards are meant to increase literacy and prepare graduates for a college or a career. A critical part of the standards is the identification of what needs to be taught at each grade level. Test assessments are also being developed to support Common Core standards. The standards outline the information students should be able to understand prior to graduation. This, in turn, will help graduates better compete globally. Unlike our previous system, where each state developed their own education plan, Common Core is said to provide consistency on a national basis. Therefore, students moving from state to state would be able to do so more easily due to consistent standards. Part of the justification behind Common Core is the notion that American students perform poorly compared with students from quite a few other nations. In the reading test, the U.S. came in at number 24. Note how well the Asian counterparts performed. In the math test, U.S. scored number 36. Again, Asian participants ranked at the top. In science, U.S. scored number 28. Asian participants outshined them once more. Is this seemingly poor performance a blanket indictment of America's public schools? At the very least, these scores are a cause for concern. U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan called the 2012 test results proof of educational stagnation, and he may have a point. Looking at the past decade with 4 test periods, U.S. scores have not improved, despite all the government money and federal directives over the past decade. For the first time in the test, 3 states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Florida, participated individually in addition to being included in the national scores. Massachusetts, known for high standards and performance, perhaps best in the U.S., scored well in math, science, and reading. Florida, the epicenter of education reform efforts by Jeb Bush, dubbed the education governor, scored below both international average and U.S. national average. OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, analyzed the scores for correlation with noteworthy attempts at education reform, specifically reducing class size and expanding school choice. Surprisingly, they found no correlation. Secretary Duncan has been an advocate for both of these proposals. Now Duncan is focusing on more preschooling, raising academic standards, recruiting more top-notch educators. Of course, Duncan is also in favor of Common Core standards. A key question is whether or not having national standards improves test results. Many countries scoring below the U.S. have national standards. 11 of the 22 worst-performing countries in the TIMSS math test had national standards. 17 of the 28 countries outperforming the USA in the PISA 2006 science test had national standards, but 11 of the 28 countries scoring below the U.S. had national standards. Standards are not the critical difference for improving U.S. student performance versus students from other nations. We need to dig deeper to better understand why U.S. students don't perform better on these international tests. First off, poverty. The U.S. has one of the highest child poverty rates in the world. It's 2 to 3 times higher than South Korea, Germany, Finland, Estonia, and the Netherlands. Van Rokel, president of the National Education Association, the largest teachers union, calls poverty the main cause of our mediocre PISA performance. High-poverty U.S. schools posted dismal scores, similar to Kazakhstan, Romania, and Cyprus. So let's look at wealthy U.S. schools. For this purpose, we define wealthy U.S. schools as those with less than 10% of students eligible for subsidized lunches. The wealthy U.S. segment performed well in all 3 test areas. Viewed as a separate entity, the U.S. wealthy would rank number 2 in the world in science and reading and number 6 in math. If we increase our definition of the wealthy schools to include those with 10 to 25% in poverty, the segment would rank 8th in reading and science and 17th in math. Finland, a nation that has historically performed well in these tests, has a low poverty rate of 5%, compared with the U.S. poverty rate of 23%. If we probe further to understand what makes the U.S. different than some other nations, we begin by understanding the demographic, cultural, and socioeconomic circumstances involved. According to Jason Richwine of National Review, While the U.S. gets mediocre scores, it also has demographic and socioeconomic challenges that the more homogeneous European and East Asian countries do not. We should also take note that in another test called TIMMS, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, the U.S. performance was quite different than our PISA results. U.S. 8th graders handily outscored 7 nations that were ahead of us on the PISA. U.S. 4th graders outscored 12 other nations that did better on the PISA. Respected educator and former Assistant Secretary of Education Diane Ravitch adds valuable insight. Ravitch states, the U.S. has done poorly on every international math test since the 1960s, but that hasn't stopped the U.S. from driving major scientific advancements decade after decade. She suggests that U.S. teens may not be as serious about those no-stakes tests. This is a logical conclusion given many of the distractions that U.S. students have in their lives. If the U.S. education system is so poor compared to other advanced nations, why would China consider emulating it? The Chinese Ministry of Education has been so impressed with the USA innovations that it's pushing schools to stop fixating on standardized tests and embrace a more hands-on model of education, the American model. With Common Core, we may be going the opposite direction. Shadow education refers to teaching that occurs outside of the classroom, usually performed by private tutors. In China, almost 74% of primary students receive supplementary lessons. For Hong Kong, the percentage of students being tutored is very high. Primary at 72.5%, middle secondary at 81.9%, and senior secondary at 85.5%. In Singapore, it's a whopping 97% of the students who are tutored. In Taipei, Taiwan, almost 3/4 of 7th graders were being tutored about 6.5 hours each week. The value of this shadow education is quite pronounced in South Korea, where 75% receive tutoring. They rank number 2 in the world in reading, and 93% graduate versus 77% in the United States. Tutoring of students in the United Kingdom has grown 18% in 2005 to 24% in 2013. Many British parents believe that government-run schools are not bringing out the best in its brightest students. Parents see tutoring as an alternative to expensive private schools. 31% of students in Britain's more affluent families are being tutored. Only 18% of students from less affluent families are being tutored. But this number is even more impressive considering that tutoring costs can run at $40 an hour. Parental involvement is key for improving educational results, whether it's investing in a tutor or just encouraging excellence in their children. This chart from the Cato Institute is both revealing and depressing. In the 40-year period from 1970 to 2010, education spending has skyrocketed to over 190%, and the number of school employees have almost doubled, while student enrollment has grown less than 10%. And what have the dramatic spending increases produced? Scores in reading, math, and science have all flatlined. What have 45 years of federal spending to the tune of $4 trillion in taxpayer money given us? This does not include state and local funding, virtually unchanged educational outcomes, and a dismal high school graduation rate that hasn't improved since the 1970s. This map shows spending by student for each state. Oregon, in the middle range of state education funding, spends almost $10,000 per student. Portland, Oregon spends over $13,000 per student with disappointing results. To reiterate, the U.S. spends more than any other nation on public education. More money is not the answer, despite politicians, teachers, and educational bureaucrats repeatedly asking for more money to solve our educational shortcomings.